Imagine putting $10,000 into a box, locking it, and leaving it untouched for 10 years. 10 years later, you open the box. Every single dollar is still there. You haven't lost a dollar. Your balance is still $10,000. But something strange has happened. Your money can buy less than it could 10 years earlier. This is inflation, and whether you notice it or not, it quietly changes the value of your money every year. Suppose the groceries you regularly buy cost $100 today. If prices rise by 3%, that same basket would cost roughly $103 1 year later. Your $100 didn't physically disappear. The problem is that the things you want to buy became more expensive. Economists call this a loss of purchasing power. Now return to our $10,000 example. If inflation averaged 3% every year for 10 years, that money would have purchasing power equivalent to only about $7,441 in today's dollars. The number in your box still says $10,000, but in real purchasing power terms, you've effectively lost more than a quarter of its value. That's what makes inflation easy to ignore. It usually doesn't take your money all at once. It works gradually, a little this year, a little next year, then again the year after that. Imagine a meal costs $5 today. With 3% annual inflation, after 10 years, that same $5 meal would cost roughly $6.72 if its price followed that inflation rate. Nothing happened to your $5 bill. What changed was what that bill could purchase. This is also why wages matter. If your income rises as fast as prices, you may be able to maintain your purchasing power. But imagine your income rises only 2%, while your cost of living rises 4%. Your paycheck is bigger in dollar terms, but you may actually feel poorer because your expenses are rising faster. So why don't governments and central banks simply try to make inflation zero forever? Because moderate inflation isn't necessarily considered a malfunction. Many central banks intentionally aim for low, stable, positive inflation. Low and predictable inflation can coexist with a growing economy and gives policymakers more room to respond to economic downturns. The opposite problem, persistent deflation, can also be dangerous. If people expect prices to keep falling, they may delay spending because they believe things will be cheaper later. If that behavior spreads across an economy, businesses can see weaker demand, which can hurt investment and employment. But inflation becomes much more painful when it rises rapidly. At 2% inflation, purchasing power erodes relatively slowly. At 8%, the effect becomes dramatically faster. At an average inflation rate of 8% for 10 years, $10,000 would have purchasing power equivalent to only about $4,632 in today's dollars. That's why periods of high inflation can feel so brutal. Your money doesn't need to disappear for your standard of living to fall. And this explains one of the problems with holding too much long-term wealth entirely in cash. If your cash earns nothing while prices rise 3% per year, its real purchasing power is declining. Even if a savings account pays interest, what matters over long periods is how that return compares with inflation. For example, if your savings earns 2% while inflation runs at 3%, your balance may grow, but its purchasing power can still decline. That doesn't mean cash is bad. Cash is extremely useful for emergencies, short-term expenses, and financial flexibility. The issue is expecting idle cash to preserve purchasing power indefinitely. This is one reason people invest part of their long-term money. Suppose an investment returns 7% while inflation averaged 3%. Before considering taxes, fees, and other factors, the gap is roughly 4 percentage points. The goal isn't merely to make the number in your account larger. It's to grow wealth faster than purchasing power is being eroded. Of course, investments involve risk, and no asset guarantees that it will beat inflation every year. Returns fluctuate, markets fall. Different assets behave differently under different economic conditions. That's why the answer usually isn't simply cash or investments. Different money has different jobs. Money you may need soon generally has different priorities from money you're building for decades into the future. And this leads to one of the most important ideas in personal finance. Never look only at how many dollars you have. There is the nominal value of your money, and then there is what that money can actually buy. Remember our $10,000 sitting in the box? 10 years later, you didn't lose any dollars. You lost something less visible: purchasing power. Inflation is one of the quiet forces shaping almost every financial decision you make. Once you understand it, you start asking a better question. Not just, how much money am I making? But, is my money growing faster than the cost of living? Subscribe Alpha Radar for more simple finance explainers.